He had everything anyone could ever dream of: mansions, luxury cars, glamorous parties, but deep down, there was an emptiness that nothing could fill. The routine of showing off was becoming burdensome, and the excitement he once felt with wealth was slipping away, like sand through his fingers. The bright lights of the parties no longer brought joy, only a sense of loneliness in the crowd. He found himself surrounded by people but, at the same time, feeling more alone than ever. The noise, the fake laughter, it all seemed to echo in a heart that longed for something real. As the days went by, that loneliness became more evident. The feeling that everyone around him was there for the wrong reasons began to bother him. Friends seemed to multiply at the parties, but when the lights dimmed, he was left alone with his own thoughts. But those thoughts offered no comfort. Instead, they made him question his choices. What was he searching for amidst all that luxury? Was life only about money and power? Or was there something more, waiting for him beyond the grand mansions? And so, a deep restlessness began to take hold. He found himself thinking about simpler things, about what he had lost along the way to the top. The relationships that had withered, the moments of peace he could no longer find. Something was missing, but he didn't know what. It was as if he was always surrounded by superficial things, unable to reach what truly mattered. The emptiness intensified, and he knew something had to change, but what? In one of those rare moments of pause, he decided to visit a childhood friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in a long time. The reunion was a surprise for both of them, but what really caught his attention was the stark contrast between their lives. His friend, far from all the luxury and glamour, lived a modest, simple life, but it was full of joy. He had a loving family, sincere laughter around the table, and a peace that seemed to radiate from within. That scene was etched in his mind. During their conversation, they laughed about childhood memories, the adventures they had together. But something deeper was happening. He realized that, as his friend spoke about his wife and kids with pride, there was a calmness in his eyes. It was as if his happiness didn't depend on bank accounts or extravagant trips. The millionaire, who had always believed that success was measured by material wealth, started to question, how could someone be so fulfilled without all the things he considered essential? As they said goodbye, the contrast between their realities weighed on him even more. He drove home in his luxury car, but the image of that simple and happy family stayed in his head. The sound of genuine laughter echoed in his thoughts, and his friend's smile was living proof that happiness couldn't be bought. Something inside him started to change, as if a seed had been planted. Maybe what he was searching for was closer than he thought, just in a form he had never considered. In the following days, the feeling of emptiness only grew. He tried, unsuccessfully, to fill that void with more extravagant purchases and meetings with people who only reinforced how far he had drifted from what truly mattered. He no longer felt like going out, and the luxurious trips he used to take became uninteresting. It was as if all the sparkle in his world was starting to fade, leaving only the darkness of a life without purpose. On lonely nights, the silence was heavier than ever. He wondered if it was possible to find something that could truly fill that void. As someone who had always had everything he wanted, it was unsettling not knowing what was missing. Somehow, he wished he could be like his friend, finding peace in small things, in moments shared with genuine people. But where to start? What could he do to break free from the cycle of superficiality and get closer to something real? One night, he had a bold idea. Looking out the window of his luxury apartment, he watched the taxis moving through the busy streets. Then, something sparked in his mind. What if he disguised himself as a taxi driver? It could be a way to escape his reality, to connect with real people, with authentic life stories. He no longer wanted to be the untouchable millionaire, he wanted to be invisible, and, in that way, understand what really drove people. The idea, although unusual, made sense to him. Instead of being the person judged and surrounded by interest, he could just be another face in the crowd, with no one knowing about his fortune. This way, he could truly get to know people, hear their stories without the filter that money usually imposed. He decided it would be a kind of personal experiment, trading the steering wheel of his luxury cars for that of a regular taxi, and seeing what the real world had to offer. With the plan in mind, he felt a new energy surging. It was a kind of adventure, something that would take him out of the monotony he was living in. Maybe this was the opportunity he had been waiting for, the chance to discover what was missing in his life. Without further hesitation, he made the necessary preparations, bought a simple taxi, and, under a new identity, was ready to roam the streets and hear stories that could transform his view of the world. Right from the first days as a taxi driver, he realized he was facing a completely different world from the one he knew. The stories he heard from passengers ranged from moving to tragic. Some talked about unimaginable hardships, like losing everything in a fire or battling diseases that medicine could barely explain. He started to get emotional over the strength that so many of these people had, facing challenges with a courage he had never witnessed before. Each new ride was a window into a different reality. There were those who spoke of their achievements, hard-earned victories, and the moments when, against all odds, they managed to turn things around. Others, however, carried the bitterness of defeat, feeling abandoned by the world. For him, it was like watching a movie with every new ride, each with its own heroes and villains. And as he listened, he started questioning his own struggles, which seemed so small compared to those stories of resilience. As time went on, he found himself looking forward to these rides, eager to hear what his passengers had to share. It wasn't just an experiment anymore. He was learning from each story, from every emotion his passengers let slip in the back seat of his taxi. With every turn he made, he felt like he was getting closer to what he had been searching for, a deeper understanding of life and the people around him. But he knew that eventually, he would find something, or someone, that would change everything. Not all the stories he heard in the taxi were moving or inspiring. Among the conversations with humble, hardworking people, he also crossed paths with arrogant and superficial figures. Some rides were dominated by passengers bragging about their material achievements, treating the driver as if he were invisible, as if he didn't matter. It was a reflection of the world he had been trying to escape, and these people, ironically, reminded him of who he used to be. One time, he picked up a woman dressed in expensive clothes, who spent the entire ride complaining about the service at her favorite restaurant and the delay in receiving her custom jewelry order. Everything seemed so insignificant compared to the struggles he had heard before. The disdain with which she talked about other people's work made him realize even more how wealth and luxury could distort one's perception of reality. While she rambled on about her trivial issues, all he could think about was how much more beauty there was in the simplicity of ordinary people. These encounters only reinforced his decision to continue with his experiment. Every arrogant passenger who stepped into the taxi pushed him further away from the world he once belonged to. The superficiality of some people made the depth of others' stories even more striking. He realized that, despite being surrounded by wealth, the true value of life lay in sincere connections, in the authentic emotions that emerged in the most unexpected moments. And he kept going, waiting for the next ride that would leave a significant mark. One ordinary afternoon, he stopped the taxi to pick up a new passenger, and to his surprise, it was an old friend from the parties, someone he used to share extravagant moments with. The friend, not recognizing that the driver was, in fact, the millionaire in disguise, started talking casually. During the ride, without any hesitation, the passenger mentioned the millionaire's name, beginning to criticize him with sarcasm and disdain, as if he were talking about someone distant and irrelevant. What shocked him most wasn't the words, but the tone of contempt with which his supposed friend referred to him. He spoke about how the millionaire had isolated himself, how he had become boring, dull, distant. It was as if all the friendship they had once shared had been nothing more than a facade, sustained only by parties and luxuries. He, sitting behind the wheel, listened in silence, feeling a mix of sadness and disappointment as he realized that the person he had once considered a friend actually knew nothing about him. When the ride ended, the friend got out of the car without even glancing at the driver. He sat there for a few moments, processing what had just happened. That moment brought to light the confirmation that his old relationships were as shallow as the parties they used to attend. And deep down, he knew he was on the right path, far from that world of falseness. But that didn't make the feeling of betrayal any less painful. One particularly chaotic afternoon, with the city's traffic crawling along, he stopped to pick up a passenger who seemed to be in a hurry. When she got into the taxi, the look of concern on her face was unmistakable. He quickly realized that, aside from the traffic, something else was weighing on her mind. The young woman, a candy seller, was talking on the phone with her aunt, desperately explaining that she was running late and that she needed to sell the candies that day to pay for her mother's medical test. As he drove, he couldn't help but hear the urgency in her voice. The story, so full of sacrifice and need, touched him in a way he didn't expect. She was a simple woman, struggling to support her family, something completely distant from the world he lived in. The contrast between her battle and his trivial concerns was stark. He found himself thinking about how, in the midst of so many parties and luxuries, he had never met someone so genuine and resilient. Throughout the ride, he watched the candy seller more closely. She carried a determined expression, even in the face of so many difficulties. He decided to strike up a conversation. As she spoke, he could sense the depth of her determination. She wasn't complaining, just explaining her challenges with the firmness of someone used to facing difficulties without losing hope. Her story was one of sacrifice and resilience. She worked tirelessly to help her mother, yet she still managed to keep a smile on her face, as if the hardships were part of a necessary journey. He felt inspired by her strength, something he had never encountered in the people from his social circle. The conversation continued, and she shared a little more about her life. Since she was young, she had learned to fight for everything she needed. Her dream, she said, was to go back to school and become a psychologist, but that seemed far away. Between work and taking care of her mother, there was neither time nor money to invest in herself. She wanted to work with children, to help change lives, but for now, she was stuck in the reality of selling candy to survive. He, in turn, listened to every word, feeling a mix of admiration and sadness for the difficult path she was on. When they finally arrived at her destination, he decided not to charge her for the ride, feeling that this small gesture was the least he could do given everything she was going through. And as she stepped out of the taxi, he knew that this woman wouldn't leave his mind. Something about her had sparked a feeling in him that he couldn't explain, but that would undoubtedly change him forever. After that emotionally charged ride, he couldn't shake the restlessness he felt as he headed back home. Not charging for the ride had been a small gesture, but for him, it was significant. As he drove back to his mansion, the candy seller's story echoed in his mind. He knew she wasn't just another passenger, something about her had touched him deeply and in a way that was different. Her story of struggle, her love for her mother, and her dream of becoming a psychologist made him feel connected to a reality that, until then, had seemed distant to him. When he arrived home, he couldn't stop thinking about the candy seller. What moved him most was her strength, the way she faced challenges with a dignity that so few people in his world seemed to have. He spent the night reflecting on how, with all the money he had never experienced that kind of genuine connection with another person. And for the first time in a long while, he felt that there was something, or someone, worth pursuing, something that had nothing to do with wealth or status. That night, he couldn't sleep well. The image of the candy seller and her words kept replaying in his mind. He felt an uncontrollable urge to help her, but at the same time, he knew he had to be careful. He didn't want her to see him as a rich man trying to solve her problems with money. He wanted to make a difference in her life, but without destroying the simplicity and authenticity that had captivated him. The doubt remained. How could he help her without revealing his true identity? Then, he came up with a plan. He decided he would return to the place where he had first met her, hoping to cross paths with her again. He knew he couldn't just show up persistently, but something in his heart told him they needed to meet again. The next day, he took his taxi at the same time he had met her and drove to the same spot. At each stop, he looked around, searching for that familiar face among the crowd. The anxiety grew with every minute, but he knew he had to be patient. After all, she had her own routine, her own challenges, and he didn't want to seem intrusive. But the desire to see her again kept pushing him to keep coming back, day after day, at that same time, hoping that fate would bring them face to face once more. After a few days without success, he started to question whether fate would really unite them again. Maybe that encounter had been just a coincidence, and now he should move on. But at the same time, there was something that wouldn't let him give up. He kept going back to the same spot, hoping to see her selling her candies, but time passed and she didn't appear. The city seemed enormous, and he felt powerless in the face of the vastness of places where she could be. Even with the mental exhaustion of not finding her, he continued driving through the streets, listening to many stories. What had initially been just a search to fill a void had now become a journey to discover what truly mattered. Then, on an ordinary day, just when he had almost given up hope of seeing her again, fate finally stepped in. He was driving through a busy street when, glancing to the side, he saw her once more. She was standing outside a shop, selling her last few candies with the same determined look as before. His heart raced, and without thinking twice, he pulled the taxi over to the curb, as if the world around him had stopped just for that moment to happen. There she was, and all he wanted was to talk to her again. He got out of the car, trying not to seem too eager, and approached her with a smile. When she recognized him, a spark of surprise and happiness lit up her face. They started talking, and he felt relieved to hear that things were going a bit better. Her mother was stable, and though selling the candies was still difficult, it had been enough to continue with the treatment. He offered her a ride, and the conversation flowed naturally, as if they were old friends who had reunited after years. He learned more about her life, about the dreams that had been put on hold, and about her desire to go back to school. Every word she spoke only deepened his admiration for her. After that unexpected reunion, the connection between them began to grow stronger. He made it a point to pass by the same spot every day, just to give her a ride back home and see her for a few minutes. Each conversation revealed more about their lives, and he found himself more and more enchanted by her simplicity and strength. With each word they exchanged, he felt that the bond between them was becoming deeper, as if they were building a bridge between their two very different worlds. And she, in turn, began to trust him more, feeling comfortable sharing details about her life that she had once kept to herself. What had started as a simple taxi ride had turned into something he never could have imagined. The light conversations were gaining a depth that made him wonder how he had lived so long without something like this. He began to notice little things about her that captivated him, the way she smiled when she talked about her mother, the timid hope in her eyes when she mentioned her dreams. These interactions, even if brief, became the highlight of his days, and he knew he was already emotionally involved. However, as the relationship blossomed, he felt a weight on his chest, the secret of his true identity. He knew that at some point, he would have to tell her the truth, but he feared the impact it could have. For now, he preferred to live in the moment, strengthening their connection. One day, he invited her out, suggesting they go to a simple diner, a cozy place he used to visit in his youth. She accepted the invitation with a shy smile, and inside, he could hardly hide the anxiety of spending a night by her side. On the appointed night, he waited for her outside the diner, but when she arrived, he was speechless. She looked stunning, even more beautiful than he remembered. The simplicity of her beauty, combined with the humility she always carried, left him completely enchanted. He had never felt anything like this before, a mix of admiration and affection that went far beyond any physical attraction. And in that moment, he knew he was truly falling in love. During dinner, the conversation flowed naturally. They laughed a lot and had fun. He had never imagined that such a place could have that kind of power and be the perfect stage for a night that would be etched in both their memories. As the night went on, he felt something he had never felt before. It was as if, for the first time, he was on a date that wasn't about luxury or appearances. There, in that simple place, with a woman who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, he found a sense of peace and belonging that he had never experienced at his extravagant parties or in expensive restaurants. Her smile, the small laughs during their conversation, all made him realize just how much he was falling in love. At the end of the date, when he dropped her off at home, he felt like he needed to say something, but the words seemed stuck. Instead, he simply thanked her for the evening, leaving it unsaid just how special she had been to him. When she went inside, he felt a momentary emptiness, but also a certainty. He couldn't let this feeling slip away. He knew he would need to see her again and that he would do everything he could to be more and more present in her life. In the conversations that followed after that unforgettable evening, she began to open up even more. And as much as he wanted to solve all her problems at that very moment, he knew he couldn't. The secret of his true identity still kept him in a delicate position. He wanted to help her, but without her knowing about his fortune. The connection they had built was so authentic, and he feared that revealing who he really was might destroy everything. And so, with every conversation, he felt increasingly torn between wanting to change her life and the fear of losing the woman he was falling more and more in love with. As time went on, their meetings became more and more frequent. He never missed an opportunity to see her, whether it was for a quick conversation during her candy sales or to share a meal at a modest diner. With each meeting, the bond between them grew stronger, and he felt that it was no longer just a fleeting connection. There was something deeper happening, something that went beyond simple curiosity. It was clear to him that he could no longer hide what he was feeling. The feelings he had been holding inside were now on the surface. He wanted to be present in every moment of her life, to help her, and above all, to make her happy. After several sleepless nights thinking about her, he decided it was time to take the next step. During one of their light-hearted, relaxed meetings, he surprised her by saying he wanted something more. With his heart racing, he leaned in and kissed her. With the relationship now official, he began to become even more involved in her life. He met her mother, who welcomed him with warmth and gratitude. Little by little, he was woven into the simple, love-filled routine of the family. The feeling of belonging surprised him. It was as if he had finally found what he had been searching for all along, a family that saw him not for his wealth, but for who he really was. However, even with the growing happiness, the secret of his true identity still hung over him, and he knew that sooner or later, he would have to face it. The longer time went on, the harder it became to hide his true identity. Their relationship grew stronger every day, and he feared that revealing the truth might destroy everything they had built together. She saw him as just a simple taxi driver, someone who lived an ordinary life, and that was a part of their connection that he treasured most. What would happen if she found out that, in reality, he was a millionaire? During moments of intimacy, he often imagined how to tell her the truth. He thought of countless ways to approach it, but always ended up fearing her reaction. What if she felt betrayed? What if everything they had built came crashing down because of this revelation? The fear of losing her love and trust consumed him, and he kept postponing the decision to come clean. But he knew that, sooner or later, he would have to face this truth. He couldn't keep the secret forever, and every day, that reality drew nearer. The dilemma followed him to every meeting, in every act of affection she showed him. He knew he wasn't being completely honest, but at the same time, he felt there was a part of him that still wanted to protect that pure and simple relationship. He began to plan the best way to tell her everything, hoping that the love they had built would be strong enough to overcome it all. Finally, the time came when he decided to reveal his secret. So, he decided to invite her to a special dinner, but this time, it wouldn't be in a simple diner or during a taxi ride. He invited her to his house, or rather, to his mansion. The invitation was made carefully, and he explained that he wanted to show her something very important about his life. She, unaware of what was awaiting her, accepted the invitation. On the appointed evening, he picked her up as usual, but this time in a car she had never seen before. When they arrived at the grand mansion, she was visibly surprised. She asked him whose house it was, and he just smiled, saying everything would be explained soon. As they walked through the vast property, his heart raced. He knew this was the decisive moment. The entire scene, with the large gates, the immaculate gardens, and the mansion's luxury, contrasted with the simplicity of the relationship they had built up until then. When they entered the main room, he asked her to sit down. With his eyes fixed on hers, he took a deep breath and began to tell his story. He said he wasn't who she thought he was. He explained about his life as a millionaire, about the disguise as a taxi driver, and the reason why he had chosen that experience. She listened in silence, her eyes reflecting a mix of surprise and confusion. He knew he was putting everything on the line, but he also knew he needed to be honest. Now, all that was left was to wait for her reaction. His words echoed through the room, and the silence that followed was deafening. She looked at him, stunned, not knowing what to say. Everything she thought she knew about him seemed to have collapsed in a matter of seconds. The simple taxi driver who had accompanied her through difficult days was now revealed as a millionaire, the owner of that grand mansion. For a few moments, she stood still, trying to process all the information. It was as if she were living in an unreal story, and the weight of that revelation left her in shock. He, on the other hand, watched every one of her reactions, his heart pounding, fearing the worst possible response. The fear that she might feel betrayed was there, pulsing in his chest. He knew that this truth was hard to digest. She had always valued simplicity, and he feared that this revelation might push her away. After a few minutes of silence, she finally began to speak. Her voice was strained, and the words came out slowly. She questioned why he had hidden his true identity for so long, why he hadn't trusted her from the start. He explained, sincerely, that all he wanted was to disconnect from the superficial world that surrounded him and that, upon meeting her, he feared that his wealth might ruin the connection they had built. He said he had fallen in love with who she was and didn't want money to interfere in their relationship. She listened attentively, the emotions clearly mixing inside her. She was confused, scared, but also touched by the honesty he was finally showing. It was a revelation that, deep down, would change the course of their story. After hearing his entire explanation, she took a deep breath, still feeling the weight of the revelation. Her emotions were complex. On one hand, there was the shock of discovering that the simple man she had fallen in love with was actually a millionaire. On the other hand, there was the understanding that he hadn't done this out of malice. He genuinely loved her and wanted to protect her from a world she didn't know. As she reflected on everything, something began to change inside her. A sense that perhaps all of this had happened for a greater reason. She began to see the moment as a divine intervention. God, in his wisdom, had placed this man in her path not just to help her, but to teach her something deeper. Instead of feeling betrayed, she began to feel moved by the magnitude of what was happening. The journey they had traveled together, with its difficulties and secrets, seemed to be part of a larger plan, a plan she could never have foreseen. It was as if, all along, God had been guiding their steps, leading them to this moment. Tears began to roll down her face, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. She looked at him and said that, although she was scared, she was also deeply touched by the way everything had unfolded. For her, it was as if God's hand had been behind every decision, every encounter, and that, in the end, they were exactly where they were meant to be. She couldn't ignore the feeling that this was all a disguised blessing, an opportunity to grow and build something new, now without secrets. After so many emotions and revelations, they sat side by side, feeling the weight of the truth finally lifted from their shoulders. The silence that had once been filled with uncertainty now seemed calm, almost comforting. She, with a light heart, realized that the love she felt for him wasn't based on wealth or status, but on the person he was. The journey they had traveled together, with all its ups and downs, had only strengthened the connection between them. True love, the kind that overcomes barriers and secrets, had finally prevailed. He, in turn, felt a sense of relief and happiness that he hadn't experienced in a long time. All the fear of losing what they had was dispelled by her acceptance. Now, there were no more secrets between them. She knew him completely, and yet, she had chosen to stay. Their relationship, which had begun so simply, now had a depth he had never imagined. From that moment on, he knew he would build a life with her, based on sincerity and mutual respect. Over time, she returned to her studies, with his support, and began to realize her dream of working with children. He, in turn, found in life with her the happiness he had been searching for. It wasn't money or luxury that completed him, but her presence and the love they shared. Together, they built a new life, where simplicity and true love prevailed over any material wealth. In the end, it was love that united them and showed them that true wealth lay in the people they connected with, not the things they owned. Did you enjoy this story? If so, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more stories like this one. And don't forget to leave